Bloom's taxonomy is a useful framework, I guess, when we talk about learning outcomes, and that is primarily because of the way it identifies and categorizes language. So, Bloom's taxonomy of educational objectives is basically a framework for classifying statements of what we expect or intend students to learn as a result of instruction. So you can see how it would tie into learning outcomes there. The framework was conceived as a means of facilitating the exchange of test items amongst faculty at various universities in order to create banks of items, each measuring the same educational objective. So essentially the concept behind the thing really was that it had kind of broad aims of improving communication and practice among educators. And the taxonomy, as identified there, was just kind of a way of classifying intended behaviors related to cognitive acts or thinking. And it's since been very widely accepted by curriculum designers, teachers, administrators, researchers, so on and so forth. So this is the kind of original Bloom's taxonomy. Now, according to Bloom, basically the idea here is that by ordering categories according to complexity, basically you kind of create a hierarchy. So each classification or each kind of section of that pyramid basically kind of informs us about the skills and the ability related to that classification order. So essentially it identifies, according to the level of the pyramid, what level of ability or understanding and from that assessment the student would have to do. So for example, application, which is in the middle of the table, is obviously above comprehension. Comprehending something is kind of higher up than just knowing something about it, so on and so forth. And the idea with this kind of categorization and this hierarchy really is basically that kind of at the lower end of things, you have lower order thinking skills. So for example, knowledge, just being aware of something, comprehension, having some understanding of it, as opposed to the higher order skills at the top of the table, which is more to do with kind of, more complex cognitive asks, like critically evaluating something, synthesizing something, analyzing something, so on and so forth. Just FY, synthesizing there might not mean what you think. It's kind of in this kind of reference, it's kind of building a structure or a pattern from diverse elements. So kind of pulling disparate, different kind of information together to make something kind of comprehensible. And I suppose very much for yourselves, the notion is really that kind of, you're very much kind of, as educated, intelligent kind of students, you're much more aligned, or what you're doing is much more aligned with the higher order thinking stuff. So for example, instead of assessing you by just giving you like a multiple choice quiz, which would be more related to knowledge or comprehension, you know, all your assignments really are asking you to evaluate something or to create something or to analyze something. And the logic kind of behind this is straightforward enough, as identified there. Before you can understand something, you have to remember it. Before you can apply the concept, you have to understand it. Before you can analyze it, you have to be able to apply it. Before you can evaluate it, you have to be able to analyze it. Before you can create, you'll have to do all of those things. So the notion is that kind of, you need to kind of complete the lower levels before you can kind of use the higher levels, if that makes sense. When we talk about kind of the taxonomy associated with Bloom, basically the notion is that kind of for each of the different categories, for each of the different levels in the triangle, there are particular kind of tasks and particular vocabulary that go along with each. So for example, if we're talking about knowledge, then you're talking about students being able to recognize something, being able to list something, being able to describe something. If you're talking about comprehension, you're talking about students being able to interpret something or summarize something or paraphrase something or explain something. If you're talking about students' application, you're talking about them implementing something, using something. Analysis, you're talking about them comparing something or outlining something or attributing something. If you're talking about synthesis, you're talking about them critiquing or judging or testing something. And if you're talking about evaluation, you're talking about them designing or constructing or producing or making something. So the idea obviously is kind of why this is relevant for learning outcomes is specifically because of that use of language. So one of the key elements, as we know, for writing a good learning outcome is this notion of an action verb. There is a verb in a learning outcome that explains what a student will have to be able to do by the time the program or module or course or whatever is finished. By the end of this module, students will be able to evaluate a piece of e-learning according to a number of critical instructional design criteria. So obviously, evaluate is the action verb there. And as we know, evaluation is top of the table when we come to Bloom's taxonomy. So again, for individuals such as yourselves, if we're talking about evaluating something, then in the assessment, we're going to be saying, okay, or in the learning outcome, we're going to be saying, okay, they're going to be evaluating something, or we might say they are going to be judging something, or they are going to be testing something. And again, it's not a chronological or a linear order, but there's obviously quite a lot of interplay between the learning outcome, or excuse me, the verb that's being used, where that lands in Bloom's kind of hierarchy, and the learning outcome that's going to use the action verb, and obviously then the assessment in question. So all of those things have to kind of line up. If I'm talking about students and I know that I want them to be kind of up here in terms of what they're doing, then my learning outcome is going to be, okay, by the end of this module, they are going to be evaluating something or synthesizing something. And if I'm saying they have to be evaluate or synthesize something, then obviously the assessment that I give has to reflect that. Hence, go off, pick a piece of e-learning and evaluate it according to relevant instructional design criteria. Now, what happened, so Bloom's taxonomy was kind of initially developed back in the 50s, but it was revised by Anderson and Krathwohl in 2001. Now, the revised taxonomy has the same goals really as the original Bloom's taxonomy. It just more, reflects updates in language, approaches, and so on and so forth since the original taxonomy from 1956. And it also became a two-dimensional framework when it refers to both knowledge and cognitive processes. So the initial Bloom's taxonomy was more related to, I suppose, cognitive processes, really. You don't need to worry too much about that element there, the two-dimensional framework. My experience is, for the most part, that doesn't really come up. It really is primarily, for our purposes at least, just related to the notion of action verbs and how those kind of tie into writing good learning outcomes. So that is the two-dimensional element. Again, I wouldn't kind of worry too much about that. This is more, this is more kind of relevant for us. This really kind of reflects how the revised taxonomy changed some of the language around. So you can see there's two elements there. One is that the terminology which is used is much more, I guess, straightforward and much more related to the actual verb. So instead of talking about knowledge and application and synthesis, it's much more kind of the actual action verb you're going to use. So students remember, students understand, students apply, evaluate, so on and so forth. And the other thing which it did then was it took the evaluation, the synthesis, and it kind of swapped them around and tidy up the language a bit. So for example, the second to top category is evaluate, and the top category then is create. And that is obviously beneficial, or certainly makes a lot of sense, particularly when we talk about, for example, we think about these different kind of categories and the different kind of skills involved and the different kind of ability involved. And top of the table really would be to create something. So for example, for your project next semester, the ultimate challenge in terms of the masters in this area is to go off and develop a very good piece of e-learning, a very good e-learning solution. So creating, therefore, is top of the table. And a lot of the stuff I'm getting you to do, for example, for your assignment for the instructional design module, that's worth 80%. The task is to evaluate something. So create is top of the table. And this revised taxonomy is what is used nowadays, really, compared to the older one. Just more straightforward, more applicable, more appropriate, I guess. And again, like the The language which is used kind of is subject to somewhat regular updates. So for example, in a lot of kind of best practice now, the advice is not to use the term remember. It's to more refer to having an understand, not having an understanding of, but kind of having comprehension of, or being able to articulate or being able to describe, as opposed to saying by the end of the for the example, by the end of the module, you will remember XYZ. So maybe just be aware, this is the kind of, this is what is used nowadays, but it is also subject to, you know, informal constant updates, and kind of the use of language kind of changes around quite a bit. And I suppose one other thing which emerges obviously from Bloom's taxonomy nowadays as well is that there's a lot of remixes of it. So there's lots of different ways of kind of articulating it, excuse me, or describing it. So for example, this is an alternative viewpoint, and that kind of, I suppose, makes less of a distinction between analyzing and evaluating and creating. So according to this kind of viewpoint of it, you know, those three are kind of top of the table, and they all are either, depending on your interpretation, like equal in terms of what they require from students, or else to be a master, to master the task at hand, you have to be able to analyze and evaluate and create. This is kind of a somewhat dated kind of look at Bloom's digital taxonomy. And again, the notion here is really, it just takes the key terms associated with the taxonomy, and it just kind of links to a number of different kind of, I suppose, action verbs, but action verbs specifically related to particular digital skills. So at the bottom of it, it might just be favoriting something or Googling something. But then when we're talking about creating, you're talking about people podcasting or video casting or filming or animating or so on and so forth. And that then is a view of Bloom's taxonomy, maybe just with a view to, again, kind of digital tools. Again, it's not, I would say, like, take any of these with kind of a grain of salt, because they're always, there's never going to be a completely comprehensive, up-to-date one. But again, this is one that is maybe more aligned with, for example, social media and Bloom's taxonomy. So for example, at the bottom of it, you're just talking about texting and instant messaging. Higher up, then you're talking about presenting and blogging and collaborating and so on and so forth. So as we've identified, one key area where Bloom's taxonomy would be particularly useful is as a common language for learning goals, as a way of identifying the meaning of broader educational goals. So for example, you know, if we're talking about a specific course or a particular curriculum, you know, you might look to align national or kind of like standards within an institution to what you're using for the module. It's a way of ensuring the conformity of objectives, activities in the curriculum. So yeah, the notion that kind of, okay, if, you know, I know that Shane and Brian's module and Jessica's module and Paul's module and Gerald and Roisin's module, all our modules are using the same language when we talk about the learning outcomes. So we're guaranteed that there isn't going to be too big of a disparity between the different modules. It's not like I'm giving you a very, very, very simple assignment or activity, and Shane and Brian are giving you a much more complex one, at least with a view to learning outcomes and examining the range of educational possibilities in the course or curriculum. So essentially, those are all kind of saying the same thing. And I guess the main element where Bloom's taxonomy comes into play, particularly with a view to formal education and higher education institutions, is when you're talking about designing a learning outcome. So we know, for example, that writing a good learning outcome involves an action, word or verb, the learning to be demonstrated, and also a criterion for acceptable performance. Where Bloom's taxonomy kicks in, obviously, is the action verb element. So if we're talking about remembering, these are some terms we might use. So learners have to be able to recall, they have to be able to define or describe or identify. If we're talking about the understanding category, we're talking about learners estimating, defending, distinguishing. If we're talking about the evaluating category, then we'll be talking about learners critiquing, defending, describing, comparing, apprising, so on and so forth. So yeah. So yeah, on successful completion of this module, learner will be able to critically engage with key concepts, models, and frameworks in the field of instructional design. So you can see there, we have the action verb, in that learners will be able to, I guess, critically engage. We have the learning statement, which is the learning that will be demonstrated in the performance. And we also have a broad statement of the standard for acceptable performance. So the entire thing really kind of is that last part. By the end of this, they will be able to critically engage with key concepts, models, and frameworks in the field. So that is the kind of broad statement of the standard for acceptable performance. So if we're talking about writing good learning outcomes, we're talking about including conditions in which a student should be able to demonstrate their skill or knowledge, which obviously lines up with the whole notion of being able to guide assessment, be measurable if at all possible, and be flexible in terms of assessment approaches. And that's less essential, I guess. So if we were to look at that previous slide, then we will be talking about conditions in which students should be able to just demonstrate their skill or knowledge. So yeah, so there is a way of getting students to demonstrate their ability to engage with key concepts, models, and frameworks. And there is a measurability element in there as well, in that is something we can actually interrogate or test to some degree. Does a student know how to critically engage with key concepts, models, frameworks? And again, obviously that lines up the assessment activities that you've been asked to do. And as identified, I know that there's like SMART plans or SMART whatever. This is a slightly different one. It's more SMART learning outcomes, but the notion is a good learning outcome should speak to the learner. So it should address what they know or will be able to do. It should be measurable, in that it should indicate how learning will be assessed. It should be realistic in that learners who complete it should be able to I guess, demonstrate the knowledge and skills addressed. It should be time bound, so there should be a deadline, and that's usually, by the end of the course. It should be transparent, and that should be easily understood, and it should be transferable in that it should kind of tie into the wider world. As we talked about, as opposed to a learning a learning objective, which is more to do with this is what the course will do. It should kind of tie into the wider world. So they should be able to do this, not just within this course, but in the wider world. If we were to look at this as a learning outcome, students should know the main pedagogical schools. Doesn't really specify systems or information about the system. Students should know there's not very much information. They should know the main pedagogical schools. So what does that mean? Is that just name them, recite ideas, criticize them, so on and so forth? So if we're going to improve that, we might say students should know the behaviorist, cognitivist, and constructivist pedagogical schools, which is better because it says the information they should know, but it doesn't really explain how much they should know or what they should be able to do in relation to that. So an improvement to that then is students should be able to recognize and articulate the basic assumptions, central ideas, and main criticism of the behaviorist, cognitivist, and constructivist pedagogical schools. So obviously that is a much clearer, more effective, more appropriate learning outcome. So again, the process is really to try and, even if you wanted to start very basic, but be aware that you should be, a learning outcome should be, without making it into an essay all of its own, it should give as much information as possible. It should kind of clearly articulate, what is the student expected to do, to what level they're meant to do it at, what kind of concepts or elements does it relate to, so on and so forth. So, the more information, I guess, again, without making it into an essay of its own, the more information you can fit in a learning outcome, the clearer the learning outcome will be, and the more useful it will be to everyone involved. So as a student, if you're looking at that, it's a pretty clear indication of what is going to be expected of you. If you are an instructor looking at that, then kind of you clearly know, kind of, for instance, okay, well, I'm going to have to cover these areas in the module learning material. And if we're talking about assessment, there has to be something in there that kind of requires learners or gets learner to recognize and articulate the basic assumptions, central ideas, and main criticism of those. So moving on from learning outcomes, and again, just a final mention, I guess, learning outcomes are, I know they kind of seem quite academic, and I guess they are quite academic, particularly in terms of like the specificity of language used and so on and so forth. But it is the main kind of measurement in a huge amount of places where you know, the identification of a learning outcome, as we've identified in a lot of stuff prior to this, is kind of very important for good learning and good instructional design to take place. So being able to specify that is important, whatever you're doing. And obviously, it ties into a number of additional areas, for instance, EU and national credit frameworks. So maybe something people have heard of before. This is the Irish National Qualification Framework, so the NQF, and that was basically developed as legislation. And it basically is a framework through which different kind of learning achievements and associated credits might be measured and related to each other. And they're all based on, I suppose, the level of knowledge, skill, competence involved in each. And this is developed by the QQI. So sorry, the name escapes you for a moment. The qualification. Sorry, you might have to look it up yourself. The name has escaped me. But the QQI is basically kind of the body, the national body inside Ireland, who is responsible for outlining, explaining, and kind of categorizing qualifications and kind of awards in the Irish kind of education system. So you can see there basically that kind of, you know, at the very bottom, we have a level 1 certificate. As things improve, you know, we might talk about an advanced certificate or higher certificate. And then people such as yourselves are going to be all the way over here in a level 9 master's degree or postgraduate diploma. Top of the table then obviously is a PhD, so a doctoral degree or a higher doctorate. So I suppose it is important to be aware of these, particularly if you work in formal education or higher education in any way, just on the basis of being aware where each of these different kind of awards lies in terms of the level that's identified there near the center. When we talk about different kind of qualifications or different awards, obviously you might hear people talk about a level 7 award or a level 8 award or level 9, whatever. And I suppose the key element there is that is an indication of, you know, does that refer to a master's degree, a certificate, a diploma, so on and so forth. So people might talk about a level 8 award, and it's important to be aware of that's pretty high up. And the issue with any of those is, you know, if you're talking about a level 5 certificate, it is important for that to be accredited by QQI. It's important to be aware of the requirements around that. So it should be, and like the QQI would have, and any kind of national qualification framework will have quite specific rules about what a level 5 cert has to be. So X amount of learning hours, this type of assessment, this type of learning outcomes, so on and so forth. And obviously, the higher up you move through the different levels, the more demanding the requirements are. So, you know, it's good to be aware of this, I guess, with a view to, yeah, just, you know, not just the Irish one, but wherever you go on to work, to be aware of what the qualification framework, the national qualification framework is, and what it will actually require of you if you do want to offer some form of accredited kind of degree or qualification. And there is also then obviously a European one. Now, there is a certain degree of alignment between the European qualification frameworks and the national qualification frameworks, but obviously they're not going to map over completely because each country has their own systems, and the European one, excuse me, will have kind of a different system. But this is kind of just a rough indication of the EQF, the European Qualification Framework. And again, it's similar enough in that kind of there are 8 levels to the EQF. You know, EQF level 3 would refer to secondary level, which is a secondary diploma or a vocational diploma. And then when you're talking about level 7 and 8, you're talking about a bachelor's or a master's or a doctorate. So that's how the Irish NQF corresponds to the EQF. And a better representation of that actually is here, which identifies, okay, if this is the NQF level, this is the corresponding EQF level. And you can see there, like, obviously, because there's 8 levels to the EQF and 10 to the NQF. Area number 6 in the EQF contains ordinary bachelor's degrees and higher diplomas. So again, it's not something you need to know off by heart, but it is useful to know about if you do go on to work in formal education or higher level education or whatever, just as a reference. So to be aware of the European kind of qualification frameworks and how those might align with the national qualification frameworks. And another element maybe to be aware of, just with a view to the European qualification framework, is that each of the 8 levels in the EQF is identified by learning outcomes, but those learning outcomes have 3 kind of descriptors or 3 elements to them. So in the EQF, learning outcomes are expressed in terms of 3 elements: the knowledge, the skills, and the competence that is associated with that learning outcome. And you can see there, for example, if you're talking about level 1, knowledge is just basic general knowledge. The skills are basic skills to do simple tasks, and the competence is when the EU talks about competence, they talk about responsibility and autonomy. So a level 1 kind of competence would be to work or study under direct supervision. At the level 8 level, then the knowledge is obviously at the advanced frontier in the field. The skills at that level are the most advanced and specialized skills and techniques, and the competence is substantial authority, innovation, the ability to kind of work independently, and again at the forefront of the particular field. If you'd like to know a little bit more, a resource I would recommend, at least in an Irish context, is the National Forum for the Enhancement of Teaching and Learning, and that's the national body for kind of leading out in terms of higher education and learning in Ireland. And I suppose why they are useful is because they have a lot of resources in relation to all of this, and they have a great number of reports and guidelines. So if you are interested in, I guess, the Irish element of it, the National Forum is a good place to go. And they do quite a number of research projects, working with a number of Irish higher education institutions, just relating to, we would have done a number of projects for them, for example, on kind of emerging areas like, digital badges, micro credentials, micro learning, so on and so forth. The final element then, and this is more just kind of as something to think about for yourselves as opposed to anything kind of major, is basically this notion of, it's an area I'm interested in myself, so I just like to bring it up with people, I guess, the notion of learner as customer. So if we look at kind of higher education nowadays, obviously, and how it's advertised, it's all very positive, it's all very pleasant. Here is someone kind of having a great old time in the library, looking through stuff. Look at all these happy students having a great time in their higher education institute, and just generally kind of enjoying themselves, having fun. Everything's fantastic. They're not under any pressure or anything at all like that. And I'm sure you know yourselves from your own ongoing experience of this master's that is very often not the case, that formal education, higher education in particular, particularly at the level you are operating at, is stressful. It requires tremendous amounts of energy and determination and ability and time and effort and blood and sweat and tears. So it is, I suppose, an area of interest of mine how higher education is kind of marketed as a very positive, pleasant, engaging, kind of fun experience, which is quite at odds with the actual process of taking higher education or education in general, because it can be very challenging, it can be very demanding, it can be very stressful and upsetting. And what drew my interest in this originally was a few years ago, I saw an excellent presentation by Professor Ray Land on the student as customer and troublesome knowledge. And the point that Professor Land was kind of made, I'm not sure if people have come across this notion of threshold concepts, but the idea of a threshold concept and troublesome knowledge is kind of this idea that the most impactful and transformative education any of us have generally kind of relates to, knowledge or information or learning that kind of almost like transforms our view of the world. But having your view of the world transformed can be a very painful process. It's not something that comes very quickly or easily. It might require you to kind of grapple with how you thought the world was versus this new information that comes along and changes all of that. And that kind of relates to a notion called threshold concepts, which is like to understand this concept, to kind of get the knowledge and ability associated with a particular concept, you have to cross a particular threshold, which can be very challenging and demanding and stressful and upsetting, and so on and so forth. And I suppose I've links to the presentation and I'll put those up in Canvas as well. But I guess the notion is kind of this idea almost that yeah, that it can be a very kind of challenging process. But obviously that's quite at odds, that notion, with the whole thing of student as customer. And I would say as well, I'm sure I'm sure none of you feel particularly catered to in this masters in terms of having an easy time or whatever. But I guess there is a notion as well of, the student as customer, and kind of in a very consumerized, commercialized world, there is kind of a maybe somewhat of a disconnect between the notion of the student as, a customer, and kind of to a certain degree, there is an expectation. Look, I paid my money, I expect to get my degree. And that versus the notion of troublesome knowledge and kind of challenging and difficult and stressful, but ultimately hugely rewarding and sometimes life-changing education. So I'm kind of interested in that notion and would be keen to hear any thoughts you would have around it as well. That notion of student as customer, and you are entitled to a certain level of support and a certain level of experience and a certain level of kind of customer service, I guess, as a student. Because you've paid your money, you pay your taxes, you're entirely entitled to a positive educational experience. But how exactly do we balance that out with, to a certain degree, particularly at year level, what education should be, which is challenging and, difficult, but ultimately transformative. So it's just a final little kind of thought on the entire thing. And if you do go on to work in kind of higher level education, I think that is a challenge you're going to have to navigate or kind of equip yourselves to deal with. That kind of, how do you, challenge students and kind of, engage students, but in a way which is positive and which also doesn't, mean that students have a very negative experience, which means that, kind of they aren't overly stressed. So it's a balancing act. I'll put up links to that presentation and a video recording of the talk he gives in it. Be very keen to hear your own thoughts on that. As always, thanks very much, everyone. And yeah, look, I'll talk to you.